Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week's guest is Kurt Couchman, a senior fellow in fiscal policy at Americans for Prosperity. He's written a lot about the federal budget, including his newly released book, Fiscal Democracy in America: How a Balanced Budget Amendment Can Restore Sound Governance. That new book will be the subject of our discussion today. Kurt, welcome to Facing the Future.
Well, thanks for having me, Bob. I'm excited to be here and longtime admirer of the Concord Coalition.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, given your background, this book must have been sort of a labor of love for you. I just point out for our audience that you worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years for a number of members of the House. You also worked at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the Cato Institute, and almost all of it have had something to do with the federal budget. So let's sort of begin with why did you want to write this book at this time? I mean, you obviously must be concerned about the fiscal trajectory the country is on. So let's start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the federal budget is not in great shape. We've got a debt to GDP ratio of 100% and rising. If you just look at debt held by the public, we're in pretty dangerous territory. And the thought when I started writing this book was that we still had a lot more time than we have now. I started writing it in 2019. And I was inspired because, there are a number of different balanced budget amendment proposals out there. Most of them have similar problems, and there are a couple that don't have them. And that those came to be because I was looking at the different proposals out there and realized some of these problems, and other problems occurred to me over time. And so I wanted to go out and see if it'd be possible to re-engineer the balanced budget amendment concept into something that would be a solid foundation for bipartisan governance, solving problems, for fiscal responsibility, and sort of the things that I learned from working on two different BBAs on Capitol Hill, and then thinking about implementing legislation and how it all fits together. I thought that was something interesting that I should share, and people might be interested in it.
Well, let's go back to some of the real world consequences of this debt debt trajectory that we're on. I mean, what is it? How are people going to feel it as some, so that it's not just some abstract mathematical thing?
We're already feeling it. I mean, the inflation that we experienced the last couple of years was the result of the money supply growing faster than the economy, and the money supply grew faster than the economy because the Federal Reserve looked around and didn't see anybody else able and willing to pick up all the new federal debt that came about not only during the pandemic, but really built up considerably during the 2008 financial crisis, and then slowed down, but not quite enough to reverse that in the interim. So we've had the inflation, we've had higher interest rates. We're having slower economic growth now. Maybe we haven't felt it yet, but there's an enormous amount of academic literature. The international organizations have talked about debt drag for a long time, and that means we're probably missing out on somewhere between 4/10 and half a percentage point of growth because of the debt drag, the crowd out from investment capital being sucked up to finance federal debt instead of being put towards productive uses out there in the economy. So we're feeling that, and then we're also feeling it in terms of the federal government's dysfunction. We have there's sort of a moral component of this where the American people see that government is essentially taking from the future to pay for the present priorities. And so there's a moral failing there. But then it's also making our politics more partisan and more vitriolic than it needs to be. I come from the more conservative wing of Capitol Hill, and a lot of those members would be fine voting for some of these supplemental emergency spending packages if the federal government were otherwise fiscally responsible and the debt itself wasn't at threat of provoking a crisis.
Yeah, you raised a number of important issues there, not just the effect of the deficit, but the effect, on Capitol Hill, the dysfunction
Yeah.
around the budget. One last thing on the debt, because you raised this as a question. I we get this all the time. Is that, well, look, our debt is high, but I mean, look at Japan. Japan's got a much higher debt to GDP ratio. So what's the big deal?
Yeah,
And
Japan is
so
oh, sorry.
why don't we want to be Japan? I mean,
Yeah, two things about that. First of all, Japan has had a lost generation, or really two at this point, of economic growth. They have grown, but they've grown much more slowly than we have in terms of per capita income. And so that's really driven by productivity. There's also an aging of the population issue that's more acute there. But we don't want to miss out on that growth. We will be much poorer if we miss out on that. And I certainly expect to be here in 20 or 30 years when it's sort of built up to the point that we feel it. So that's an important part of it. But the other thing is that the Federal Reserve had a working paper a year or two ago where they compared the US situation with the Japanese situation. And if you standardize it so it's apples to apples, we're actually in a similar position to what they are, but they are moving in a good direction and we are moving in a bad direction. So let's not pretend that just because on paper our debt to GDP ratio seems a lot lower than Japan's, that we're fine. We're actually in as bad, if not worse, of a position as Japan right now.
yeah, and I don't think their experience over the last 25 to 30 years is something is an example to emulate.
Right. Absolutely. No.
So even if they haven't totally gone under, but all right, so let's take a trip down memory lane. Back in the 90s, balanced budget amendments were proliferating on Capitol Hill. And I have to say, there was more of a norm of fiscal responsibility in those days. I mean, we routinely did budgets, and now we routinely don't do budgets, unless you want to do a reconciliation bill and it gets into procedural stuff. But I mean, just the normal blocking and tackling of doing an annual budget is something that we just don't really do much anymore. And of course, the forget about trying to balance the budget. We're nowhere near. And so there were a lot of balanced budget proposals back in the 90s. You referred to some of them. Some of them had their flaws. Give us a little bit of a background on the history of balanced budget amendments in that era.
Sure. Well, first of all, we didn't need anyone to even be proposing balanced budget amendments for a long, long time. It wasn't until the Great Depression when the movement really started, and it was started from a Maryland Democrat, and then was picked up the next year by a Minnesota Republican, and then it was bipartisan the whole way through into the 1990s. Charlie Stenholm and Schaefer, was it Bob Schaefer? They had worked together for a long, long time. This is a Republican and Democrat duo. So there was broad bipartisan support for the idea of balancing the budget. We had three presidents, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, that worked with Congress on deficit reduction packages. And we eventually got there. We balanced the budget in 1998 through 2001, or maybe I'm shifted by a
Yeah, no,
year.
you're right. 98, 2001. Those were the four big years.
Yeah, that's right. And so um, there was this broad bipartisan support. And part of that, I know you had oh, what's his name? Sorry, I'm blanking on his name now, but he talked on your show about how um, there was a lot going on at that time in terms of like the interest cost to revenue ratio being really high, and that helping members of Congress and administrations of both parties get to the point of saying, "Hey, we need to take this seriously, or the bond market's going to do it for us." And we're at that level again, and heading a lot higher. So I think we could actually see some real bipartisan consensus reemerging. But what was interesting is that they had some real flaws in those BBAs at the time. The biggest one was the idea of balancing the budget every year. See, revenue bounces around from year to year. It's really volatile. And if you were to tie spending and revenue tightly together, you'd have all kinds of policy instability for both spending programs and tax provisions that would create a lot of uncertainty, suppress investment. So you don't actually want to do that. And there are actually a number of Democrats that pointed this out at the time. But because of that, the external forces and that wellspring of broad bipartisan support for doing something, the House passed a balanced budget amendment for the first and only time in 1995. So it can be done, but
And then
it takes a combination.
as I recall, it failed in the Senate by one vote.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
think it was, yeah.
Mark Hatfield, the Republican from Oregon, is credited as being the one who killed it. But my understanding is that there were a number of Democratic senators who voted for it who would have been happy to vote against it if they had needed to keep it from going to the states.
I think that's probably true. Hatfield took all the heat.
Yeah, that's right.
To the
And of course,
point that I think Bob Dole even came to his defense, even though he was, pushing for the balanced budget amendment, but he
yeah.
thought Hatfield was getting too much of the heat for it. All right, so we're gonna leave. We're gonna take our first break, and then we'll come back and talk about the more modern versions of a balanced budget amendment. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. I'm talking with Kurt Couchman of Americans for Prosperity, and we'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Kurt Couchman, Senior Fellow at the at Americans for Prosperity. We're talking about the possibility of the pros and cons of a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And we were talking about how they came very close to, Congress came very close to passing a budget amendment in the 1990s. After a while, though, the budget was balanced. By 1998, the budget, quite unexpectedly for many of us, turned out did balance and stayed that way till 2001. And we've had increasingly large budget deficits ever since. There was a fiscal crisis, there was the pandemic. And so, anyway, right now we're in with very, very large budget deficits for as far as the eye can see. So it raises the question again of whether we should look for some sort of an overall cap or some sort of break on the growth of federal debt. And before we look at possibilities in the United States, it has been done elsewhere. And in your new book, you did point out that other countries have tackled this. And I just wanted to invite you to maybe cite a couple of examples where other countries have faced a deficit crisis and managed to wrestle it to the ground.
Yeah, so it used to be that most of the high income countries did not have balanced budget requirements, but now most of them do. And it took a crisis for most of them to get there. In fact, it took a crisis for the US states to adopt these rules as well. A lot of northern states invested in canal building or borrowed extensively to build canals, and a lot of southern states borrowed extensively to capitalize small banks. And then with the Panic of 1837 and some other things going on, it ended up that 8 states in the territory of Florida defaulted on their debts because they had borrowed way too much. And then the bond buyers basically required the states to have debt limits and balanced budget rules in order for the bond buyers to start buying state debt again. Abroad, this has been a similar story. Sweden, for a long time, was seen as like the ultimate and a social safety net, but it turns out that that became unsustainable. Their spending was growing dramatically far beyond their revenue. Their debt burden was accumulating rapidly, and so they knew they needed to change course. They needed to change both policy and also institutions in order to lock in that responsibility. And balance doesn't indicate the size and scope of government. It just says that you have to pay for what you're going to spend, maybe not that year, but in relatively close proximity. So they did that. They spent 30 years working on their policies, on their institutions, and their debt, their net interest costs have fallen dramatically. Their debt burden has fallen dramatically. It's a little difficult to separate the different pieces because it all works together. The institutions help the policies not only be adopted but also be sustained. And a similar story happened in Switzerland. Switzerland, also in the 90s, was having a growing debt burden. They're very highly decentralized. It requires a vote of the people to raise taxes at the national level. And so the bond markets were starting to get a little jumpy at a much lower debt burden than you might expect. And so they had a couple of years where they deliberated about how to get things under control. And they, again, also did policy. They did some institutional things. In 2001, the legislature finally put to a vote of the people what is now considered to be the constitutional side of the debt limit, or of the Swiss debt break. And a few years after that, the legislature passed implementing legislation for the debt break. And so you have the constitutional piece that is principles based and kind of sets the general direction, and then the statute sets all the details in motion so that you have something that you can actually govern within. And it's a similar story all throughout Europe now. There are balanced budget rules, sometimes combined with spending limits or debt limits or revenue floors. Like, there are lots of different options for how you put this stuff together, but a balanced budget rule is by far the most common.
And in Switzerland, what, just kind of briefly, what is the break? I mean, I keep reading about the Swiss debt break
Yeah.
and wonder, and we can talk about how that could be updated for the United States, because I know you've written about that. But just briefly, what is the Swiss debt break?
Yeah, so they limit spending to the cyclically adjusted revenue. So, revenue kind of goes up and down depending on the business cycle. And they say, if we were operating at full employment, full productivity, whatever the revenue would be, that's what you can spend up to. And then they have two different accounts. One is keeping track of emergency expenditures. And then depending on how big that is, they have to pay it back, offset it subsequently over 3 or 6 years, or if it's a huge thing, it can be later, but they have to say in statute how that's going to work out. But they also have a compensation account where, if the budget is not balanced in the way that it's supposed to be, then they need to take account of that and they have to reduce their spending or raise revenue in order to make the math work out. So they have the amortization account and the compensation account, and it's worked incredibly well for them. They have been growing a little bit as a share of global reserve currency. Small economy, relatively speaking, but it's one of the most prosperous in the world, and things seem to be going very well for the Swiss right now.
I take it that their political system might not be quite as dysfunctional as ours. I mean, it seems that you have to have some, I mean, you really have to have buy-in to this from the legislature to, and I don't know what, if they have a party system there or whatever, but I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
everybody has
actually,
to agree to abide by the rules anyway and make them work.
that's right. Yeah, a couple years ago, I was at an event where a Swiss official was speaking about the Swiss debt break, and I asked him, "Well, so what's the automatic enforcement look like for the Swiss debt break?" And he sort of looked at me puzzled for a minute. And he's like, "Well, we don't have anything like that. We just follow the rules because that's what we're supposed to do."
Well, yeah, well, we might have to go a little bit further in a US version of
Maybe.
that, but we'll see. So let's then turn this to the US system. You began thinking about this, you said back in 2019, or probably mid
2010. I started writing the book in 2019. I started thinking about BBAs seriously in 2010.
okay, so this is a decade in the making, more than a decade in the making. What were some of the lessons that formed your thinking on this? I mean, you reached some big conclusions based on failures of prior BBAs and what might work. And so, what are some of the bigger lessons that you applied here?
The most important one is that if you have provisions in your BBA proposal that one side or the other really doesn't like, then you're dead in the water because it takes two-thirds of both houses of Congress and three-fourths of state legislatures to pass and then ratify a constitutional amendment. So you just have to focus on the basics and do them in a way that makes sense. We already talked about how annual balance doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so you want to balance over the medium term or the business cycle. Budget wonks call it structural balance. And that's exactly what Switzerland and Sweden and lots of other places that do it well do. Another thing is you need a reasonable period of time to get to balance. I think a decade is probably the best that we can do. And then the question is, what kind of balance? Is it primary balance where you don't count interest costs, or is it full balance where you do count interest costs? It's a question of feasibility versus effect. I mean, primary balance would stabilize the debt burden for a while, but then we'd probably have to go to primary surpluses in order to really get the debt burden down into the safety zone. And then there's a question about, emergency relief. We have emergencies; they come up from time to time: recessions, wars, lots of things, pandemics. And when you look at the history, you see that by and large, those have all passed Congress with two-thirds or far above two-thirds supermajorities, except when congressional leadership decided that they wanted to maximize benefits to constituencies rather than focusing strictly on the emergencies. And two-thirds is also the highest threshold in the Constitution for extraordinary legislative actions. So that made a lot of sense. You don't want to have like differing emergency thresholds. Some of them would actually encourage military conflict for the purpose of fiscal unrestraint. And
This declare a war because you haven't been able to balance your budget. So
right. And then the other thing, which probably is more interesting to people these days, is that most BBAs would put the president's budget request in the Constitution. It's already required by statute. I don't think we want to mess with the balance of powers any more than they've already been messed with right now. So that's another one that's kind of a sleeper issue. But to me, I think it matters a lot.
I think that I can certainly verify one of the insights of things that are like poison pills or non-starters for one side can kill it, because we used to do something called a fiscal wake-up tour, and we
Mhm.
had people from Brookings and Heritage and people from think tanks that didn't agree with one another. And that was one of the principles that we set out in talking to audiences, is that you have to be able to find some sort of common ground and recognize, I guess the you have to be able to recognize what the other side is saying,
Right.
and somewhere you can sort of meet in the middle. But something that doesn't do that is just you're going to have two people having an argument rather than trying to solve a problem. We're
I
going to
think
have
that's
to
right.
take our second break here. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Kurt Couchman. He's a senior fellow at Americans for Prosperity. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Kurt Couchman, senior fellow in fiscal policy at Americans for Prosperity. And we're talking about a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution in the United States. We've been talking about some efforts in other countries, some efforts that have been made here. And we were talking about what are the, big picture policy issues that, or even political issues that you need to talk about in terms of just getting people to discuss a BBA. I think, Kurt, if when we're talking about trying to do this, make another run at that here in the United States, people have a lot of preconceptions about what a BBA would be. Some of them legitimate, some of them not. And so let's talk about some of those. Um, you were mentioning, well, what are some of those preconceptions that need to be overcome?
One of the biggest is that there's a lot of conservatives in particular that believe that a balanced budget amendment is a vehicle to enshrine conservative fiscal and economic policy forever. And I think that's a mistake because I don't even know if you get majority support for that. I suppose it depends on the Congress, but you certainly don't get two-thirds supermajority support in Congress to send a BBA proposal to the states, and you don't get three-fourths of state legislatures to approve that. You need to have something that is neutral, predictable, stable, a real tool for governance that encourages Congress to fix its budget process so that it's possible of reaching and staying in balance while also representing the vast diversity of the American people. And so it's just a different mental model for how you approach these questions if you're thinking, well, how do we, build consensus and try to bring everybody together versus how do I get what I want to be the law of the land forever?
Yeah, I think on the progressive side, you'd probably have a lot of people assuming that a balanced budget amendment would be the end of Medicare and Social Security. It would mean that you couldn't do um, major benefit programs like that, or that they would be the target. And I think the point is to reach some sort of place where the spending that you're going to do is going to be paid for by the revenue that you're going to raise
Right.
and working something out that way. So you talked about, and I think this is very important because one of the criticisms of the balanced budget amendment is that it would be too rigid.
Hmm.
And you talked about in your concept, you don't necessarily have to do year by year balanced budget, but budget over some cycle, which allows for some flexibility. So describe what you call in your book a principle based BBA. And before you do that, I just want to say, could you name the title of your book? Because I've referenced it a couple of times. It is for sale now. So pitch the title of your book and where people can get it, and then let's get back to my question.
Absolutely. So the book is called Fiscal Democracy in America: How a Balanced Budget Amendment Can Restore Sound Governance. It's available at least where major online books are sold or major online book retailers. It's also available at the Springer Link. Springer Nature is the publisher, and they have actually more information on their page, little chapter summaries and keywords and all that kind of thing. Um, so the principles-based balanced budget amendment doesn't try to put the mechanics in statute. Most constitutional provisions that already exist are broad principles that we could all agree on, or at least the founding generation could agree on. And it takes statute to clarify what the details are and how they actually work in practice. If you look at, to raise and support armies, okay, that's a couple of words. There's thousands of words of statute that clarify what that means, how it's done, etc. And so the principles-based BBA takes that approach. The core line of it is that spending or revenue and expenditure shall be balanced, which may occur over more than 1 year. So that raises a lot of questions, right? And it's the need you need to have implementing legislation to fill that in. And the reason is that that's a broad principle that we should be able to reach consensus on, and future generations, for all time to come, should be able to agree that that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. So when you think about the implementing legislation for that, there's two pieces. There's the targets and the enforcement, and then there's how do you have a budget process that will empower Congress to turn all the different dials you need, get the bipartisan consensus on what those are, strike the deals, and make it happen.
Yeah, I like that approach because otherwise you're turning the Constitution into a piece of legislation,
That's right.
which it's not designed to be, and a very detailed piece of legislation at that. When you think about it, I kind of the concept is interesting in the sense that it seemed to me that what you were saying is the budget process is broken, fiscal policy is out of control. If you put this principle in the Constitution, it will reset the fiscal responsibility norm. And now Congress, because the amendment would be adopted by the people, one way or the other, through the
Hmm.
constitutional process. And it would be saying to Congress, and now it's your job to figure it out.
That's right.
Those things that you talked about, targets, enforcement, and the process. And it's almost like using the Constitution to reset the budget process, which might seem extreme, but the budget process needs to be reset. And if it's going to be reset, then you have a responsible target to go with. So now the lawyer in me, the other side of me, is going to say, why pass an amendment when you have no idea how you're going to enforce it? So you've also been trying to, or not only how you enforce it, but whether it even could be enforced. So
Hmm.
what's your concept about that? I mean, if the if the if the amendment passed, would there should be some idea of how it would be enforced?
Hmm.
Should we be doing that in Congress now with model bills to do that?
Yes, absolutely. And most of that legislation has already been introduced. So when it comes to filling in the details, look, I used to think that if Congress just passed a balanced budget amendment, then Congress would somehow figure it out. It was sort of waving hands and magic speak. But I became interested in figuring out how exactly to do that. And so there is a bill from then Senator Braun, now Governor Braun, and House Majority Whip Tom Emmer called the Responsible Budget Targets Act, that is essentially an American adaptation of the statutory side of the Swiss debt brake, balance over the medium term, subsequent offsets for emergencies, and a couple of adjustments. Like, you can adjust the spending limit for changes in revenue policy, for automatic stabilizers, for emergencies. And then there's the automatic enforcement piece. What we have currently in the federal government doesn't really work. So there's a new model that I talk about in the book as well, where you have a bunch of different dials that incrementally get turned by OMB in order to help enforce the budget targets. But then the most important thing, you mentioned way back in the beginning that Congress used to do budgets, but the truth is that Congress has never done a budget. And by that, I mean a budget is something that has all the spending, all the revenue. We do appropriations each year, sort of. I mean, not perfectly, but it's the 12 bills. But together, they're all of about a quarter of federal spending, none of the revenue, none of the tax expenditures. The new borrowing is not really part of that. Net interest isn't really part of that. So we don't really have a full budget to speak of, but there is legislation that, again, Senator Braun's office and Representatives Blake Moore from Utah and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez from Washington put forward, called the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act. And that's really just a map, a perfecting amendment to the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, to move from appropriations only, which doesn't work very well, to this comprehensive budget where all the committees are involved in managing their portfolios every year. And you get a lot of members with a vested interest in passing the annual thing, instead of, at least from the members' perspective that I used to work for, it being, it's the appropriators thing. I don't really have any stake in this. I don't care. It's got stuff I don't like. I'm going to vote against it. So that's the real big piece of fixing the way that Congress budgets. But then getting started and concluding on time are also important pieces.
Yeah, you're right about the budget. There really isn't a budget. This is a budget process,
Hmm.
which isn't followed anymore, generally speaking. But that idea of having a comprehensive budget is a very good one. Right now, I mean, we have nothing, and even the president hasn't submitted a budget this year. So this
Not the entire thing, just parts of it. Yeah.
this little pieces of it, bits and pieces of it. Um, on the enforcement side, well, let me ask you this. On setting targets, the budget, and we'll probably have to go over the other segment, but what you're thinking about in setting targets are budgetary like deficit targets to reduce the deficit over a period of years.
Yeah, it's primary structural balance is the budget nerd term. Primary meaning that net interest isn't included in the balance calculation, and structural balance and that it would happen over the medium term. The mechanics are that spending could grow with a rolling average of the last 5 years of GDP growth, and then there would be a deficit break, so that when primary revenue was less than primary spending, or sorry, when revenue is less than primary spending, then you'd have to slow down the growth rate a little bit. And then vice versa when it's the other way around, when you have primary surpluses. And so when you model it out, you see that they sort of dance along each other. There's a nice trend that develops. And then there's the subsequent offset for emergencies as well. But it incorporates both budget authority and outlays on the spending side, as well as actual revenue in making these targets. They're spending targets, but they can be adjusted if you change revenue. So it has the major pieces to actually manage the primary budget. And of course, net interest is important, but there's not a whole lot that Congress can do about it in the near term, because the debt burden is fixed, and the net interest, or the interest rates, are sort of determined by markets.
Yeah. You're listening to Facing the Future. We're going to have to take our last break. This is Bob Bixby, your host, and I'm talking with Kurt Couchman of the Americans for Prosperity. We're talking about the possibility of a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. And I'm talking this week with Kurt Couchman. He's a senior fellow in fiscal policy at Americans for Prosperity. And we're talking about a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Kurt, what about enforcing it? I mean, you have these targets and they're written in law. would that be something that would happen automatically, or would Congress have to vote on these targets, or could they undo the targets? How would the enforcement work?
Right, so they'd be statutory targets to enforce the balance principles that the principles-based BBA would put in the Constitution. So yes, Congress could amend them, suspend them, but there'd be public pushback if they tried to do that in an egregious way. So part of it is, from the BBA restoring the norm of balance and then also pushing Congress to fix itself. That's part of it. But then also the comprehensive budget is really critical here. If you were to do that, the way the process works is that there's a budget resolution that gives a top line spending allocation to all of the committees with spending authority. So that's kind of their spending cap based on the budget targets, is what it would be. If the budget resolution isn't adopted, one gets spun off at baseline levels. You could adjust that if you wanted to. And so then they would be working from that, managing their portfolios, but within that overall top line. And then members of those committees would work through their portfolios and negotiate and strike deals. And then they would have a vested interest in passing the annual budget act when it finally came to the floor, hash it out between the House and the Senate, and then off to the president. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need this automatic enforcement that I talked about, where you have a ratio between spending restraint and revenue additions, and then a list of things for the Office of Management and Budget to work down until they've met their savings target for each side of those things. That's an important backstop, I would say. And then also you could tie it to the debt limit, where maybe the debt limit is in the comprehensive budget, so you don't have to have that standalone vote that members of Congress just hate to do. And then once you've done it for the year, then that gives you until the next year that the debt limit has been raised, and then you need to do another budget in order to raise the debt limit again. And if you miss your targets, maybe you don't get to have the budget or the debt limit in the budget act. Maybe you have to have a separate vote. So there's all these different options for how you can add enforcement to this. But I think those four things working together, the public pressure and then the rest of it, would combine powerfully to get Congress to be maybe not perfect, but pretty darn close and a lot better than we are right now.
I remember back in the 90s when balanced budgets were being debated, amendments, there was a question about whether or not to include Social Security. What are your feelings about that?
Social Security is part of the budget. Every program has different value to different people, and Social Security is one that many Americans rely on. It's politically very important to members of Congress. There are some savings to be had, and there's other improvements to be had. That was set up in a time when a male breadwinner was the primary earner in a household, and so there's stuff about the male spouse and the wife that's in the code. And so society has changed a lot in the last 90 years, and so it's something that Congress should be looking at improving for the modern times, and that's just not possible under the current system. You can
Back in the 90s, I was thinking budgetarily, Social Security, one of the reasons to have it off budget was it was running a big cash surplus.
That's right.
And so in effect, it was subsidizing the rest of the budget. And people were saying, well, that's not fair. It's the reverse situation now. Social Security is running large cash deficits. So if it were excluded, the government would still be allowed to borrow a substantial amount of money over the whatever cycle we set, because it would be repaying the bonds in the Social Security Trust Fund. But that issue would certainly come up.
Yeah, I mean, there's about 7 years left in the trust fund, is what they're projecting, and after that, there wouldn't be any more ability to borrow from the general fund
Right.
unless Congress enacted new legislation.
Yes. So anyway, okay, well, how does all this get done? I mean, if let's assume that there's something comes up and maybe we're recovering from a crisis and we say, my goodness, we have to do something to make sure that never happens again. We suddenly become Switzerland. So how might something like this work its way through the Congress?
Well, hopefully we can avoid having to go through a crisis. That's the plan here. Well, you take advantage of every legislative opportunity you have. We have a couple of funding fights coming up this fall, where the government has to be funded, and it should be. There's a lot of important things the federal government does. Yes, there's some nonsense that's muddled through there, but that's an opportunity to pass things like we haven't really talked about yet, but the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act, which was government shutdowns, were something the Jimmy Carter administration created. Congress never did. needed. There might be, something in there to say that presidents can give the State of the Union once Congress has received the budget request, things like that. We could have a fiscal commission. There are other options for the funding challenges that are coming up here. There is actually going to be a vote in the House of Representatives in this month of September on balanced budget amendments. Not quite sure what the process will look like, but I published a piece, a blog post 2 weeks ago, talking about how they should learn from what happened in 1995. They got a BBA over the top, where different versions competed. They had a robust markup process in the judiciary committees, and people were familiar with the different possibilities and the advantages and disadvantages of each of those. And then at the end of the day, the House had a series of votes through a Queen of the Hill process, where the substitute amendment that gets the most votes becomes the text for final passage. And so they voted on a conservative one, 4 progressive ones, and then the broadly bipartisan one, which passed 300 to 132. And so, since we don't have that history of bipartisan consensus working together on BBAs right now, we have to restore that. And competing BBAs on the floor through an inclusive process like that is probably the best way to get people thinking seriously about this stuff again.
Well, it's a big task. I mean, when you look at the savings that you would have to do just to get to primary balance, which is again excluding net interest, it's over $5 trillion over 10 years, according to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. That's the post OBBA. So it's not a small amount of money. I mean,
Not at all.
it's a major commitment, which is why I guess you would give it like over a 10-year period to phase in. Right?
That's right. Yeah, it's hard to do. It's going to be tough. Members of Congress are going to have to strike deals. We need Congress to be the heart of our fiscal democracy, and they're just not really in the mode for doing that right now. But with better institutions, we can get better politics and better results.
And let's talk about that in the remaining. We've got about 4 minutes left. This is a good time to be talking about the No Shutdowns Act, because we've got a shutdown fast upon us in a couple of weeks. This has become an annual ritual, and it's very annoying because the budget bills just aren't passed. And so you mentioned the No Shutdown Act. Just briefly again, that would be like an automatic continuing resolution, or how would that work?
Yeah, it's automatic continuing appropriations. Flat funding is the political sweet spot. There are different variations that propose, cutting a little bit every so often, but those don't get bipartisan support. This is something we've been seeing in the States. Rhode Island and Wisconsin have had comprehensive automatic continuing resolutions for generations, back at least to the 1950s, and their budgeting is just healthier. They don't have the crazy brinksmanship that we do in Congress. North Carolina just adopted it in their comprehensive budget in 2016. They saw an incoming clash between a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. And yeah, if not for that, then things would have been really tough for the people of North Carolina. But it ended up being such a tool of legislative empowerment that they were able to move the ball forward on their priorities. And that's why the state of Kansas, or I should say the legislature of Kansas, just passed automatic continuing appropriations bill in April over the governor's veto, because they see fiscal challenges down the road, and they want to be able to avoid depleting their reserve funds and put the state on a healthier fiscal trajectory as well. So it is something that's advancing in the states, and I know a lot of state legislators are interested in bringing that to their states as well.
And in our last minute, do you have any forecasts about what's going to happen on September 30th? Will they kick the can, do a shutdown? What do you think?
Well, I don't want there to be a shutdown, but it's hard to see what people come to believe a clean CR means anymore. The rescissions and then the pocket rescissions that have been put out there just make it hard for for members of Congress to reach 60 votes in the Senate and the majority of the House to pass anything. So I don't want there to be a shutdown, but if there is, I think that widens the aperture for budget reforms that empower Congress and get our budget back on track.
And that would be an opening for another consideration of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. That's all the time we have for this week, but we'll be back again next week. I've been talking with Kurt Couchman. He's a senior fellow in fiscal policy at Americans for Prosperity. And he's got a new book out again. Kurt, what's the name of that book?
It's called Fiscal Democracy in America: How a Balanced Budget Amendment Can Restore Sound Governance.
Available wherever you buy your books and online.
That's right. That's right.
Kurt, thanks for joining us. And I'll be back again next week with another edition of Facing the Future.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.